So, greetings. Again, my name is Bremley Lingdo. I'm from Shillong, Meghalaya. I belong to the Khasi tribe here, and I'm the founder and CEO of Worldview Impact Foundation. And I'm very honored to be part of this GOAL program, which is a partnership between the Ministry of Tribal Affairs in New Delhi and Facebook, which is designed to reach out to the indigenous people and tribal people across India living in the remotest areas of our country, to train you guys so you can build partnerships, you can build projects, but based on teamwork and also how to resolve conflict. Because as you know, we work in difficult times, in challenging times, and in difficult conditions. And we will always face conflict, we will always face challenges. So it's very important for each of you to understand how to deal with these situations. So having said that, I'm gonna jump right in and share some examples of how I dealt with my own teams when we had to deal with conflict resolution and build trust in the way we work and execute our projects, not only here in India, but around the world. So first and foremost, why does conflict arise? Well, conflict arises when there is a gap or a miscommunication between you and your team members or the people that you are trying to implement a project or a program with, and their priorities are different and don't match with your priorities, or there are some other external or political forces in the works which is blocking your team or your group or your project from realizing its true potential, because they've got their own hidden agenda that you were not aware of in the first place before you started your project or your program or your intervention. So how do you go about to mitigate these risks, and how do you go about building a resolution from these conflicts from going out of control and spearing out into a real big fire? So how do you get a fire extinguisher with you to make sure that you know how to operate the fire extinguisher to extinguish that fire from exploding? So this is the key skills to have for every leader, for every team, in every situation, in every terrain or condition you work across the nation, across the different states of India. So I'll give you an example. This is going back to the creation of my home, Meghalaya, back in the 1960s. I wasn't born then, but this is a story that my father shared to me. He was the leader of the young people, of the youth. He was the leader of the youth volunteers of the first political party, the APHLC, or the All Party Hills Leaders Congress, APHLC, back then. So back in the days, in this early 60s, Meghalaya was part of Assam, and our people wanted their own hill state, autonomous state. So my father was involved in dealing with the young people. There were a lot of people who wanted to go in a full speed manner. They were even ready to go in a violent way, but he wanted to go in a non-violent, a direct action way, because he understood the principles of Mahatma Gandhi and Martin Luther King. So he wanted to use the principles of direct action, but non-violent. So he had to train all those young people back in the 60s how to campaign towards the government of Assam, the government of India, that was then led by Prime Minister Indira Gandhi, in a very diplomatic way, to bring out the aspirations of the people of the hills here in the Khasi Hills, and the Janta Hills, and the Garo Hills, that we want a full-fledged state. So of course there was lots of conflict, because you cannot make everyone happy. Everyone has got different aspirations, especially people who were quite excited to fight, to go out and liberate themselves. And my dad wanted to make sure that this doesn't happen into a full-blown conflict as other states in Northeast India, where there's bloodshed and so on and so forth. So what he did was write poems and powerful songs, because he was a very good writer, a good speaker, a good orator. And through his songs and music, he used this platform to reach out to the political leaders both in the Assam government, on the Assam Secretariat, and our leaders from Meghalaya. And back in the summer of '69, he organized the Direct Action March from a student ground, not very far from my home right now, all the way to the Assam Secretariat. And all the young people were given very clear instructions not to confront with the military or the paramilitary forces that were already in place in the Assam Secretariat. They were already armed, they were already guarded, they were expecting confrontation with the young people who were gonna be going through this demonstration to the Secretariat. But my father was very clear that no one should misbehave themselves or call for any trouble, but they must just march in peace, in a very peaceful way, and they should sing the songs that he had taught them to sing. And lo and behold, they started the march that morning in that summer of '69, and they went to the Assam Secretariat that was fully guarded with the CRPF forces, central forces, because they were expecting conflict from these young people. But none of that sort happened. All these young people sat down very peacefully, very, very gracefully, and they started singing these songs and started chanting together. They locked their hands. And then the people that were working inside the Assam Secretariat heard these songs, heard these chants. They slowly opened their doors and their windows. They saw the young people, the kids, and they were all teenagers. They brought coffee, they brought tea, they brought biscuits to them. And finally, the big doors opened in the Assam Secretariat because that trust was being built, that these demonstrators, these young people were peaceful. The only agenda they had was to have a peaceful negotiation with the leaders of the Assam government, of the Assam Secretariat administrators. And once the doors were open, my dad went in with a few leaders to actually talk to the people with the Assam government. And then, of course, that built trust, that built respect. And finally, we got our hill state, and not a single bullet was fired that day. Not a single drop of blood was shed that day. So Meghalaya was born in a very peaceful process. And Indira Gandhi came in 1971 after we got our autonomous state in 1970 to check on how the MLAs leaded business in the Secretariat and how they led the government, the autonomous state, and she was very impressed. And she came here to give Meghalaya its full-fledged state. In 1971, she came to speak, and in 1972, Meghalaya was born as a full-fledged state after being an autonomous state for 2 years. But then there are a few people in Shillong who wanted to make this capital a union territory. They said, let the mountain people, let the tribal people have their hill state, but Meghalaya will be Shillong will be ours. It will be a union territory. And then my granduncle, who was the chief minister later, Mr. B.B. Lyngdoh, said, how can we have a hill state without Shillong, the heart? How can the body survive without a heart? So my father had written a song, but in our tribal language in Khasi, about Shillong. But my granduncle then, B.B. Lyngdoh, who was the chief minister, said, we need to have it translated into English so that we can record it and take it to Indira Gandhi in Delhi. So my father had to sit all night, translate this song which talks about conflict resolution and everything, and how the people of the hills need to come together in a graceful, non-violent, direct action way. And now that we've got our state, we need Shillong to be the heart, to be the capital of Meghalaya and not become a union territory. So he then gave this new script in English, the lyrics in English, to my granduncle, who then read it. He was a lawyer. He understood the same weight, the same, punch it had, even in English. And he asked it to be recorded with a choir. They sung it together as a choir. It was perfect. They recorded it in a cassette tape back in those days in the 1970s. And they took it to Delhi, to Indira Gandhi. And Indira Gandhi listened to this song. She heard it. She heard the power of the people, the voice of the people coming from Meghalaya, who wanted to have a full-fledged state and for Shillong to be the capital. And then, based on that song, she gave Shillong to be the capital of Meghalaya. And obviously, the whole Assam government had to move down to the new capital that was established, that was Guwahati. So you can imagine, because of these conflict management skills that my dad had with the hill state leaders then, we had no bloodshed. It was totally respectable. It was totally amicable. And we got our hill state in a peaceful, non-violent, direct action way. So that was his story. Now, my story was in the summer of 99. There was a big conflict with NATO jets bombing Kosovo with depleted uranium bunker-piercing bombs. And we were in a meeting in the Hague Appeal for Peace in the International Court of Justice with Secretary General Kofi Annan. And 20,000 people came from all over the world talking about peace, talking about conflict resolution, but they were just talking. And there was a war happening in Kosovo. So all the young people, about 2,000 of us, including my brother and sister, we were gathering in front of the International Court of Justice with candles lit up in our hands, and we were chanting. We said, we need to stop this war. We need to end this conflict. So we decided to walk for 300 kilometers from the International Court of Justice all the way to NATO, to the North Atlantic Treaty Organization headquarters in Brussels. From the Netherlands all the way to Belgium for 300 kilometers. And we call our walk a conflict resolution walk called the 2000 Walk for Nuclear Disarmament, because we didn't want people or countries to arm themselves with nuclear weapons. We wanted countries to disarm in the spirit of building trust, and in the spirit of disarmament, and the spirit of peaceful security and coexisting among states. We walked for 10 days. Of course, there was a lot of conflict, a lot of people. And we went on and we reached NATO, and I had composed a song that we all sung together in front of the NATO headquarters. But then the NATO officials could not meet everybody. We selected 5 people from 5 regions of the world to go and talk to the NATO officials. And we went across, we were surrounded by the Belgian National Guard, but the NATO officials said, we can't stop the war, you don't represent the government, and we need to move on. So what happened was that some of the demonstrators jumped over the barricades that the military had put, or the Belgian National Guard, and at that point, hell broke loose. There was like water cannons, there were like police with batons hitting all the young people who were gathered, and they kind of arrested everybody, locked them up in a stadium. And I was the leader, so I had to make sure that the conflict subsided, and I asked permission from the officials that this was just a miscommunication. We didn't want any trouble, but because you did not listen to us, some of the young people got frustrated and they jumped over the barricades. But the press was everywhere, the BBC, the CNN, and so on and so forth. We were able to have a proper dialogue later with them. And then 10 days later, everyone got released, and we all went back home. And General Wesley Clark declared an end to the bombing conflict, of the NATO campaign, or the NATO bombing in Kosovo, and the war ended 10 days later. And me and my sister and my brother, we finally made it to France. We were gonna fly back home, and we heard the news that the war in Kosovo had ended, and General Wesley Clark, Supreme Commander of NATO forces, had declared a ceasefire and an end. And we were so happy that our march actually contributed to that process. And we were so happy that we were trained in building conflict between the NATO guards and the young people that were in the march for 10 days who were so tired. And we were celebrating there. So these were just 2 stories that I want to share with you. It is very important to understand both sides of the story. You must listen to both sides, and you must come to some sort of a consensus, or you must come to some sort of a compromise when you reach 2 heads that are locked and you cannot come to an agreement. So both sides must disarm, or both sides must let go to come to a common ground where you can agree together to execute or to end a particular conflict, and come to a negotiating table where you will look eye to eye with respect to each other, and you take both sides of the story, and not only be biased and carry one side of the story. No matter how good your agenda is, you need to listen to both sides of the stories to come to an agreement, to a consensus. So for you to go out to execute projects in remote areas with indigenous peoples, with tribal people, you need to ask permission. You need to have public hearings before you execute your project. You need to feel their pulse. You need to feel the challenges they have in their communities. You cannot have top-down approaches. It has to be bottom-up. You need to listen to the people, and then you can build trust, and then you can build partnerships, and then you can mitigate the risk of having conflicts in the future. Once you have the trust of the community that you want to serve, once you've built the spirit of openness and trust building, you can do anything with them. You can go for the stars. You can aim for the stars. So again, this the two stories that I wanted to share with you. And feel free to stay tuned, and there'll be more briefings, more sharings in the future. And yes, and I'm so glad that you're part of this program, and I look forward to engaging with you more as we move forward in this program. So again, thank you very much, and this is Bremley Lyngdoh signing off from Shillong. Goodbye.